Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the next in our series of Lenten devotionals this year. Have you noticed how many new ways there are of expressing old ideas these days? Now, maybe some of these are not so new, and I'm just catching up. But I've noticed, especially listening to podcasts and other commentary, be it political or cultural, the phrase virtue signaling. Well, I take it that what that means is that sometimes people feel the need to let others know that they're on board with respect to the latest and most popular attitudes and positions on things. And so they demonstrate that. They signal their virtue in some way. Well, interestingly, this may be a new phrase, but it certainly is not a new idea. It's something that goes back for a very, very long time. And it was included many times in the conversations Jesus had as he made his way to Jerusalem. Now, according to Luke, his trip was quite long, and he had many different encounters, particularly with people who were interested in knowing what Jesus' opinion was with respect to God's law and what God expected of us in terms of how we live our lives. He tended to respond to most of these inquiries. Sometimes he responded directly, but oftentimes he responded by telling a parable. The parable of the prodigal son was one such example. And another one, and the one I would like to focus on today, is the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. In that parable, Jesus tells of two people who went up to the temple to pray. One was a Pharisee, one was a tax collector. And then he describes each one's prayer. When the Pharisee prayed, he made a list of all of the virtuous things he was doing in his life and thanking God that he was a virtuous person. He tithed a tenth of his income, he fasted, he prayed, he did everything that was expected of him according to popular opinion during that time. On the other hand, the tax collector stood far off, ashamed of himself, and simply beat his breast. He had no virtue to signal whatsoever, because he was probably a person, if he was a typical tax collector, he defrauded people. He charged them more than the tax that was owed, and he pocketed the difference. Well, at some point, he realized that he was defrauding or stealing from people, so he went up to the temple and he begged for mercy rather than list his virtue. Now, the thing that was of significance in these two prayers was not that Jesus disagreed with either one of them. He doesn't criticize the virtues that the Pharisee lists. I'm sure he would have patted him on the back and said, yeah, that's the right thing to do. And he doesn't excuse the tax collector and say, oh, this poor guy probably needed the money or whatever. No excuses for what he did. But there was one phrase in the Pharisee's prayer that is sort of the punchline to this whole thing. And that was when the Pharisee additionally thanked God that he was not like that despised tax collector. In other words, the Pharisee was not just listing all the wonderful things he was doing and how virtuous a person he was. he was also using that as an excuse to despise another human being, who, even though he was not a virtuous person, was nevertheless equally loved by God. And so at the end of the parable, Jesus asks a question: who went home justified, made right in the sight of God, made virtuous in the sight of God, you might say? Was it the Pharisee or the tax collector? And this is where we get another of those amazing reversals in what people would have expected him to say. It was the tax collector who went home justified. Now, Jesus basically isn't saying anything different here than what he said when a lawyer asked him, "Dear teacher, what is the greatest of the commandments?" And his answer, as you might remember, was, "You shall love the Lord your God and your neighbor as yourself." Here, what Jesus is doing is placing in perspective what is truly virtuous and where it comes from. Virtue doesn't come from us piling up a heap of good works as if that somehow is going to get us into heaven. Virtue or justification or righteousness is a gift from God. It's a gift of God's love. Why was the tax collector justified and not the Pharisee? Because the tax collector begged for God's forgiveness, mercy, and love, while the Pharisee didn't feel as if he needed that. Not only that, but he despised rather than loved his neighbor. So, it's the same thing that Jesus had also said on another occasion. This is all the law and the prophets. If you know this, you know everything that was said. You shall love the Lord your God and your neighbor as yourself. As Brother Martin never tired of pointing out, a Christian is a person who has faith in God's love and mercy as it comes to us in the gift of Jesus Christ. Not a person who virtue signals all the ways in which he or she has done good works. That does not count as virtue in the eyes of God. Rather, it's those who seek God's love and who feel no need, therefore, to signal their own virtue, who are found to have embodied the message, because it is God's love and mercy that transforms our hearts and enables us not only to love God, but also to love our neighbor. Therefore, in conclusion, I would like to suggest that there is one way in which Christians can signal their virtue very easily. There is a famous altar in Germany. I forget the name of it. But there's a picture of John the Baptist on one side of the cross. Jesus is on the cross, and his mother Mary's on the other side. And John is pointing at Jesus on the cross. In other words, the message is, he is our virtue. That is a very legitimate way to signal your virtue, by pointing to Christ rather than to yourself. So let us offer a little prayer in that regard. Dear Lord, help us to turn daily to you for justifying mercy, love, and forgiveness, so that we may be enabled to love and accept our neighbor. Thanks for listening, everyone. We'll be back again next week, same time, same place. Bye for now.